is curiosity and sincere interest. And you're not an astrologer, but you've picked up a little bit of the milieu, I guess, right? Talking to me over the years, right?
I am by no means an astrologer, but look, this is the McLuhan way. We deal in metaphor,
Yes, yes.
and
Yep.
a lot of the insights that Marshall generated were using other disciplines to look inside other disciplines, and that's
Yeah.
what metaphor is. Metaphor is using one situation to look into another. So I don't know how anybody expects to grow their knowledge base without opening themselves up to exploring new things. I mean, it's to me, it's just silly. You can get the most interesting insights from the most unexpected places, and this is why I don't find you never know where you're going to learn something. So even what might be boring to one person, um, I've never had a conversation that has been absolutely boring and I've learned nothing from. I think bored people are boring people. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Yeah. There's a certain dullness. So awesome. And I have obviously learned a lot about astrology from studying the McLuhan body of work, including the concept that astrology is a form of environmental study, a form of studying what is normally invisible, which completely reframes it as a whole new thing, to think of it as a study of the environment, which it is. These planets are all there. You can't see them during the day. You can't see most of them at night. By using these special tools, we make the invisible into something that can be perceived.
Hmm.
So
There
the
you
reason
go.
I sought your counsel for this discussion was I'm doing a class on the philosophy of astrology, which is really about epistemology. How do astrologers know what they claim to know? Which is a scarier question than it seems, but I am, and we are taking it on here. And so the thing that's in the context of what I've learned from studying your grandfather and your father and your work is that one of the main content neutral, having nothing to do with content, right? That's the important thing, is to subtract content from the discussion. Differences between reading normally and reading a chart is that when you read normally, you're reading crossed lines, and you just kind of go on and 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 go on. Maybe you go back a second. But when you're reading astrology, you take the whole thing, you take one paragraph worth of characters, and you put it in a circle, and then you're reading like this.
Hmm.
And you're looking
Yeah,
at,
linear versus non-linear.
yes,
There's
and
a and
yes.
actually, funnily enough, after it reminded me of this artifact that I found in the office. I don't know if this is going to come
Ah,
through at all.
what is that?
Okay,
Cherokee alphabet? It's
this is.
key to the Cherokee
It says
alphabet?
on the back, Sequoyah created the first written Indian language. Uh, his syllabary or alphabet was declared official by the Cherokee Council in 1825. The first Cherokee newspaper printed 1828. Sequoyah, teacher, intellectual, leader, inventor.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about this because of the circular representation, but it's an alphabet, it's a syllabary. And the difference between this representation and your representation is that, um, for instance, with the alphabet A, B, C, D, E, F, G, those letters have no meaning in themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to replace the items on your chart with letters, you wouldn't get the same amount of information, because on your chart, all those symbols do stand for things,
Yes.
and that makes a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yep.
so there are ways that people experiment by superimposing non-linear methods onto the linear. And one of those is this thing they call the cut up, right? Which is where they take a page of text and they cut the words out of it and throw them in a hat and pick them out again and come up with things. People, Bob Dylan, I think, did this.
William Burroughs.
Burroughs famously, all kinds of people have done that. It's a way to escape the the track of linear thought and interpretation,
Right.
which seemed to be something
Hmm.
people wanted to start doing beginning in the 50s, maybe earlier too,
Hmm.
50s, 60s, 70s. David Bowie was into it. People do it a lot today,
Hmm.
even. So it's very interesting, uh, and it's been exciting to me to learn about um, what you do in astrology. And funnily enough, I've had a poem. I was approached and asked, and I'm going to have a poem printed in the Mountain Astrologer in the fall issue.
There you go. That's perfect. Because I no longer write for them, but they inherited you, so that's good. So I'd love to see this thing sometime. Um, so you, as you said, the letters themselves generally are not thought to tell stories, but runes do tell stories. So one of my early introductions to divination was studying Viking runes,
Mhm.
which are the precursor. They're kind of a Germanic-ish precursor to our alphabet, and the runes do tell stories, and they can be assembled in ways that are like hieroglyphic stories rather than like what's the word I'm looking for? Abstract letters to make words.
Quite. And
I'm
there's the big difference, because if you carve the alphabet onto a bunch of small stones and you cast them on a plate and put them together, you're not going to get the same thing.
No, you're not, but you can sometimes maybe make you can spell my name Erik or Eric. Right. So the C and the K are very different in runic. The K is much more fiery. It's Kano. It's the caret symbol, and
Hmm.
it's a fire symbol. So you can, but most people aren't doing that, and it's certainly not as evolved of a method as reading a chart like this. And as you know, I add sometimes 20 or 30 additional planets in. So there's two things added with astrology. We concentrate in a circle, and then each one of those glyphs has a long story, and then the sign that it's in has a long story, and then you can read all the connections between them, the aspects, and all the rulerships they're called. I sent you the Ptolemy table of of dignities. And so really what you get is a kind of a column. It's not really a disc. It's more of a story that's contained inside of a long, almost like a Victrola record, right?
Mhm.
Or kaleidoscope, as you were saying.
Yeah, that was the other thing that that reminded me of, was looking through a kaleidoscope, and you turn it and the different elements line, especially because of the use of color, the different elements line up, and of course the art is in the interpretation, right?
Yeah, which is, so this is very important, right? This is the turning water into wine. So I read in Marshall said somewhere back in there, Grandpa said, to read is to guess. And I looked that up, and it
Mhm.
is right in there in the definition that to read is to guess. And the topic of this class is, that's part of this is a little component, kind of a special treat of a much
Yeah.
larger syllabus, is how do astrologers actually know anything? When they look at a chart, it's a different kind of knowing than reading it in a book, because the book is very clear that this started in 1812, and then this guy said that and that guy said that, and it's footnoted, and it's all very built up. It's all very logical. But astrology suspends that.
Mhm.
And there's no certainty in astrology except the mathematics. Uranus and Saturn are in a square, which doesn't really tell you anything.
No, and that's where astronomy and astrology depart, right?
But they have an interesting overlap in that astronomers name the planets. And even if
Uh,
they don't believe in astrology, they are very good at naming planets.
I'm fascinated by that. Isn't it remarkable how we get names right? You know?
Especially, there's one particular guy named Mike Brown who's been looking up. He's been addressing the problem of name depletion and looking up
Mm.
all these obscure names like Sedna and Eris wasn't used. Incredibly, Eris had never been used for even an asteroid. That's
Mm.
to fulfill the myth. Just don't invite her. And then finally, finally in the 21st century, Mike and Chad and those guys and Dave Rabinowitz name their thing Eris, perfectly named, upsets the whole order of the solar system.
And it's so remarkable. I thought about it a lot because we have two children who we named Ezra and Virgil, and I've always been fascinated by how names happen because, you know, I you'll meet people and you'll think, oh yeah, Eric, he's such an Eric, or I'm such an Andrew. I'm not an Andy, I'm an Andrew, and
It
I'm
would never
certainly
occur to me to call you Andy.
and I
Like
oh, well, thank you, and I'm certainly not a Bob. Well, no, and that's telling.
Bob. I'm
Um,
Bob.
right,
No,
but
Jim. Sorry.
the Jim Windy, yeah, exactly. But the point is, it's funny how the name suits,
Mhm.
and it's amazing to me that we end up getting it right more often than not. Some people you'll find change their name later in life, or go by their middle name, or this or that. But it is remarkable to me how we end up getting names right. And the question is, do you grow into your name, or is
Out of
there,
it.
or out of it? I remember when we were setting to name our second child, actually, who I wanted to call Virgil after the Greek poet. And my sister, one of my sisters, thought this was an awful idea because she's thinking of the schoolyard and virgin, right?
Hmm.
And, or whatever,
Did you think of that? I didn't think of that.
Well, no, I didn't either. Like, but that's my last consideration. I'm more concerned with getting the name right than thinking about those kind of things. But she had said to me, she was looking around and looking up, and she found one helpful guide that said, when you're naming somebody, name them, give them a name that would sound great for either a judge or a rock star. And I thought Virgil fits, right?
Yep.
Because for short, I call him Verge, or the Verge, which, if you know U2, their guitarist is the
Mhm.
Edge, the Verge, similar things. Virgil also, I think, is a great name for either a rock star or a judge. And Ezra, our other child, the same, was named after a poet and after a writer. Two separate Ezras, one from the Bible, one from St. Mary's Hospital in Washington, D.C.
And the
Uh,
poet is that
yeah, Ezra Pound. He ended up confined to a sanitarium following World War II because of
right?
his activities in Italy. Um, but uh, but yeah, names. A name is a numbing blow from which we never recover, as Marshall said.
Huh. Okay, I feel better about my name, but I'm a grow into it kind of person. So
There's still time.
meanwhile, so we're the question of this the question of this body of study is, how do astrologers know what they think that they know?
Yeah.
And I think that's a question that's good, applied to everything, should be applied to everything. How do you know what you think you know? And to be in a constant reflective state about where your observations and conclusions are coming from.
Yeah. Because there's a trap. There's a trap in getting too comfortable with your knowledge, because things change. You know, first
Yes.
it's impossible that humans could fly, and then humans fly. You know,
And then no one cared.
right?
No one cared when they, just as a irrelevant sideline to that, when the Wright brothers operation, and was said to be impossible, and all these fools were trying it, they moved the operation from Kill Devil Hill out there in the Outer Banks back home, I think, to Ohio, and
Mm.
they rented a 40-acre field. Once they got it down, they knew how to build the thing and make it fly and land and take off and all this. The local newspaper never once sent a reporter. They were flying around up above this field all day long, making things, rebuild the engine, rebuild the wings, make it fly again. Whose turn is it? And they never did a story. And the editor contacted later said that was pretty stupid.
Yeah. Well, isn't that funny? So many things we think, oh, that's a fad. That'll pass. But dead wrong in that account. Yeah, and this comes back to where you opened our conversation, how um, it's information isn't as dangerous as it is vital, you know. And what we need is we need the mental robustness to be able to evaluate things.
Mhm.
But you know, we only know what we know, and having access to information, well, there's two parts to that. So there's access to a body of knowledge and not banning books and things like that, but how do we know things? And so sharpening our perceptive faculties, opening our senses. um, Another quote is, we don't know who invented water or discovered water, but we know it wasn't a fish, you know. um,
Well, but I don't like to deny consciousness. Maybe a fish did discover water. I mean,
well, they discover it when they're pulled out of it, don't they?
maybe there's really philosophical fish who are incredibly observant,
It's quite possible.
who are like these. I keep reading about how we don't know what water is, but are you kidding me? If you get
But
the fish newsletter,
the point there is to write the fish newsletter, the fish, all the fish news
fish.com.
that's fit to print. The fish wrap, right? um, yeah, what they used to wrap fish and chips in newsprint. But the point being, sharpening your perceptive faculties, opening your senses and opening your how you discover information. So speaking with you has been great over the years because I've learned all kinds of things. I collect reference texts for one thing.
Mhm.
There's a great. Are you familiar with the Brewer's Dictionary?
I have a dictionary shelf. I will buy any dictionary I see. I am not familiar with the Brewer's Dictionary, but
Oh, hold up.
please do.
Allow me to consult my shelf here. This is
Latest
exciting.
iteration of the McLuhan
I
Working
recently,
Library.
yeah, this is my shelves behind
That's
us.
a big dictionary. Are you telling me that whole thing is about brewing beer?
No, this is the Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable.
I'm thinking it's a dictionary about beer.
It's beer is going to be in here. This is this is the latest edition, which Terry Pratchett calls an idiosyncratic adventure. This is edited by 20th edition, edited by Susie Dent, and I picked it up because, so I taught this 3-month course on understanding media, on the first 7 chapters of understanding media, and to help me decode or find the backstory to a lot of the literary allusions and myth allusions that Marshall makes, like Narcissus. I consulted my dad's copy of the Brewer's Dictionary because it lists everything from Greek myths to phrases like kicking the can or anything like that are all in here. And it tells you where they came from, when they came from, how they were used. And it's a fascinating resource. It's fascinating just to flip through. It's full of things like people's like famous last words. It's got a couple pages on famous last words. It's really a great resource.
150-year development.
Yeah. It also includes now in the latest edition, the medium is the message. Which is
did they get it right? Did they get it right?
They get it right. They did better than Wikipedia. I'll give them that. Let's see here. M-E.
See, I always think the test is when you really know a topic and then you pick up the book and look up how somebody who says they know the topic does.
Right. Mead, M-E-C-D, Medici, medicine. Medium. Medium is the message. A paradoxical phrase coined by Canadian philosopher of communications Marshall McLuhan, used as the title of the first chapter in his most widely known book. And then it quotes from that. And yeah, it's pretty good. But yeah, this is what I mean by widening your base of information, because when it comes to interpretation, your interpretation, your interpretation is as deep as your language, right? Or how you can express it and even perceive it. So widening that pool is going to add depth to your interpretation, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which for me is it's about knowing the minor planets, making sure that I have developed relationships, and then there's developing the rules of classical astrology, knowing those rules, from uh, whichever century you want to count them from. It could be 4th century BC. It could be 18th century. Those similar classical dignities have remained true throughout the history of astrology.
Hmm.
So there's, on the one hand, there's a very solid foundation of thought of all these rules. Mars is exalted in Capricorn, Venus is exalted in Pisces, the sun falls in Aquarius, but things like this. And then since 1801, with the discovery of asteroids, and a little bit before that with Uranus, there's been this ever widening body of new planets. And most astrologers are incredibly averse to looking at the new planets. Really, there's
Really?
almost a taboo on looking at the new planets in astrology.
That's
Yes.
curious. Why do you
And
think that is?
I thought about this long and ponderously over the years, and I think that astrologers get to know their charts based on kind of a 9-planet model, and they develop a concept of who they are, and they are not generally interested in having that concept completely changed by adding 5 or 10 or 1 points.
You know,
Right, completely rearranges their self-concept. So I think
yeah,
more, it's personal more than anything, I think.
that's such a curious thing because if anything, if anyone should know better about how things change, you would think it would be an
Because
astrologer.
everything's going round and round, and then some are overwhelmed, they don't want to, but it's not, okay, maybe this is me talking, it doesn't have to be overwhelming. You get to know these points one by one. They have their place, like, there's a timpani drum in the orchestra, right? How much does the timpani drummer do, right? He's standing there most of the time waiting for his cue. He's waiting for the conductor to point to him. And but still, when that timpani drum goes off, it's meaningful, right? It's beautiful. It's, you want the person who plays it to really know what he's doing, right? So I find it's the same way with minor planets. You're not playing them all the time, but you want it ready when you need it. So, and that's
Exactly.
the approach that I take, is you get to know it, and you go through a phase of getting to know a new point, and then let it have its moment.
Well, that's also the musician in you, Eric.
Well, there's a lot of relationship between music and astrology. I mean, notice
Of
the
course.
relationship of the chart to the circle of fifths or fourths, right? It's 12.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of hearing, you're really listening to the chart as well as reading it,
Hmm.
and there's all kinds of harmonics. There's a lot of overlap between astrology and music. And
Yeah.
there's an interview with Robert Schmidt that's going to be part of this program, which I've been collecting stuff for years to do it. And he talks about the inventor of the rules of Greek astrology, Eudoxus of Knidos, and says that his teacher was one of the founders of music theory.
Hmm.
So the Greeks are into the circle of 12 thing, and they're figuring out harmonics and mathematics, and it all comes out of the same kind of primordial soup, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's all about resonance and harmony, isn't it? And even dissonance.
Yep, yes, very important, and rules that you have, and then you know when to bend them.
Sure. Yeah, I smiled and laughed when you talked about the timpani drum in the orchestra because,
Have you done that one?
well, no, this morning I'm getting dressed and my son comes over, Ezra, our eldest. He just turned 7 on the 21st, and he says to me, Dad, when I come down in the morning and you're still asleep and snoring, I say, oh boy, what a snorchestra. So if there was any doubt he was my son,
None. Right, he's not adopted.
no, McLuhan status confirmed,
Snorchestra.
right? This
So
is this is the same
yes.
kid in my uh in my poetry book, which is coming out next month. I started off with a poem of his, and when he was 3 years old, he was sitting on my lap, wrapped in a towel after bath time, and he said to me, a 3-year-old, he said, I hurt my angels, and my angels got tangled in 5 angles.
How old?
3 years old.
Right. So he's this unfiltered observance of the beauty of language.
Yeah, Ezra, the
Yeah.
poet,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Well, and Ezra Pound, I mean, more people should read him. I mean, so but let's talk about the portmanteau though. So the snorchestra is a portmanteau. It's a combination of two words that fit nicely. The good portmanteaus always fit nicely, but it takes snoring and the orchestra and puts it together.
Mm-hmm.
Astrology
Very
interpretation
effectively.
is a portmanteau. You're looking at. You may not have ever seen the asteroid Juno in aspect to the asteroid Atlantis. Juno is about marriage and jealousy and social justice, and Atlantis is about technology and dread and doom and fear. And
Really.
so to interpret that square, you need to make a little bit of a portmanteau. You need to say, well, what if we take a little bit of Juno and a little bit of Atlantis, knowing what you know about them and feeling their energy, what do you come up with there? But it's never right or wrong, right? It's not strictly right or wrong. Like a book is right. This is a very big difference. And
Yeah.
music is never right or wrong either. It's a different thing.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of music is you're freed, as you know, as an intellect who plays music. When you pick up that bass and you play it upside down, so you're really like a head fuck. Um, uh, there's not right or wrong when you're in music.
Mm-hmm.
There may be like, okay, if you're doing something that's strictly regimented and it's scored and it's orchestral. But even then, in the composing process, errors mean a lot. But especially in improvisation, you're freed from these concepts, these onerous concepts of strictly right and wrong.
Quite. Yeah.
And I think it's important for astrologers to know that they can never really be right. They can
Mm.
be other things, though. They can be apt. They can be apropos. They can be
Quite.
observant. They can be interesting, poetic,
Yeah.
beautiful, insightful, colorful, metaphorical. But that is different from right and wrong.
Yeah. I think this was about Eliot, T.S. Eliot. Uh, but it could have been any poet really. Somebody came up and was asking him about a poem and said, "Oh, I read this poem, and this is what it means to me, and what do you think of my interpretation?" And Eliot or the poet replied, "Well, that's pretty good. It might even be better than what I had meant to
Mm-hmm.
say, you know."
Yes.
And it really is somewhat subjective, and the point really is what's the use of it, you know? Is it useful?
Yes. This is yes. You brought up one of the core topics of astrology is what are we doing with this? So this is a crucial thing. Whenever you've got a chart, the first question is what are you doing with this chart? Right? Because if there's a car accident outside a horse racing track, the chart for the car accident could be the same chart as the horse taking a piss.
Yeah, right.
Right? And so the context and it's going to be the exact same chart if they're at the same time and place. So the question is, what are you doing with this chart? What's the purpose of this chart?
Yeah,
Why are we even looking at this chart? That's the first question.
that's very vivid example you provide there. Of course, another way to take this is again to come back to Eliot. He said that meaning is the juicy piece of meat used to distract the watchdog of the mind.
Yes, and I think that's why I suggest astrologers not that they avoid meaning and do something else,
Hmm.
or keep a very flexible concept of meaning.
Yeah.
And what I'm doing my best to sort of scatter in this discussion is the notion of like certain limited finite meaning coming from a chart as opposed to a much looser concept that I think lends itself to the precision that astrology can have when it's really working. You get there a different way
Hmm.
than the precision in like an investigative piece,
Yeah, well, that's,
right?
it might be a good idea for an exercise for yourself or anybody else learning how to read the charts is to not do one interpretation, but do a couple. Like back to your horse example, do this chart for the horse taking a leak and the horse getting in a car accident.
Yep. Yes. Or you look at the chart and you quiz the context.
Quite.
So the book for this class is it's up there with the best books I've ever read, called The Moment of Astrology by Jeffrey Cornelius.
Okay.
And few intellectual disciplines survive this analysis of astrology. Science falls particularly flat. And there's an exercise they were doing in a class at some point where the group would split in two, and each group would walk around till it found something really different and interesting. One group finds a flamingo wandering around in northern England. The other finds a sheep that got caught in the rocks and the tide came in and it drowned. And they record the time and they cast a chart for their time and place, and then they come back together and they compare charts. And people were looking at that chart for the sheep that drowned, which was like it was like Mars in Capricorn in the 8th house, and there was some influence, and they said that looks like a drowned sheep. Someone actually said that who didn't know that it was for a drowned sheep.
No.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So this is one of the crazy things about astrology, is that when you loosen up the framework enough to let it flow, this kind of thing can happen. And it can filter all the way through to the horoscope column. I wouldn't be an astrologer if I hadn't picked up the New York Post horoscope a couple of hundred times, driving home, stop at the convenience store, flip open the horoscope, and it blows my mind. Like, how is this even possible? That happens so many times. And it's the New York Post horoscope in a convenience store in the middle of the countryside. It's not supposed to work like that. You're not supposed to get anything relevant, but I got so much relevant information out of it that I had to figure out how this was done. That's why I'm an astrologer.
Well,
It was not because I intrigued by anything other than these 50-word things. Like, how is this possible? So that's what can come through when you're really doing it. And I think a lot of the frustration that astrologers have is conveying the book style of knowledge into this circular style of knowledge or knowing, and wanting to transpose one into the other, thinking there's a certainty in the meaning of the chart, and not being uncomfortable with the looseness that the chart. How can you have any certainty to this kind of a pattern? It's just way too random and chaotic. And but you can bring in relevance. You can bring in. It's a different kind of meaning. I think you get what I'm saying here.
yeah, it's poetry.
It is. It is definitely using the poetic, and my training in poetry helps me translate it back into words, because I've got to then translate it back into words.
Mm-hmm.
And there is that every syllable counts. The metaphor and the image are more important than the fact in poetry. The impression,
the connection.
well, yes, to the connection all the way through to the person reading, the connection to the circumstance, the connection to the metaphors. And then this is a different, much gentler form of meaning than I think what we're used to, than the like black, white, right, wrong kind of meaning.
Yeah, it has to be. And that's where its utility comes in, and that's how people can identify with it, right? Black, white, wrong, binaries, logic aren't very inviting, really.
No.
You have to shape yourself to it.
Yes.
Something like this allows you those gaps to fit yourself in.
Well, you find your place. You find the planets that you like, and there's always this adventure and synchronicity, which I think is much more a factor in astrology. But then again, it's how you use the tool. My first divination tool was bibliomancy. I would ask a question and pick a book and flip the book open, and and get something that would teach me.
Uh,
And so one of my principles of astrology is that the real conducting medium is consciousness itself.
yes.
That the activating force in the whole thing is consciousness, and that really astrology is a study in consciousness.
Quite right. Yeah, it's all about your awareness. And now, bibliomancy, do you have a go-to book?
No, it can be any book.
Okay.
That's the beauty of it, is it doesn't matter what book it is. The dictionary is a good one, but really any book. I mean, the Grateful Dead's name famously comes out of Funk and Wagnall's dictionary, because the Warlocks was taken and they just flipped it open, thunked the finger down, and it lands on Grateful Dead, a
Oh,
kind of
well.
a myth, a karmic myth, where the person's died and they can't afford proper burial, and then a person pays for their burial, and then the person moves on down the road of life, and robbers approach them, and then the spirit of the person who they saved frightens the robbers away, and it's the karmic story is complete. It's
Oh,
the
well.
perfect name for the Grateful Dead.
That's funny. I came across that almost that phrase last night. I was reading. I got the complete works of Blake for Christmas this year, illustrated.
By
Um,
him.
well, because he called himself a poet and engraver, I
Mm-hmm.
believe, a
Mm-hmm.
poet and printer. And I'd been looking. It's not hard to find Blake out there, obviously, but so many of the Blake books out there are just the transcribed words, and that's not how he published.
Yeah.
He published images, pictures.
Yes.
His engravings were copper plates with words scribed into them, surrounded by detail and embellishment, and then color. And if you want to experience, uh, I find when I want to experience somebody's work, I want to experience it in the way in which they presented it.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to read Blake,
Especially if
I,
they're a printer. You know he
precisely,
cared. You know he cared. He put every letter where it belonged.
yeah. So if I want to read Blake, I want to see how he presented it. So I was very fortunate to receive this for my birthday. Sorry,
Mm-hmm.
for Christmas. And
Mm-hmm.
last night the moon was quite spectacular up here. And actually, I went out to collect the sap from the buckets, and took. You can see it on Facebook, Eric. I took a picture of the moon just at the top where this tree branch once was, and it kind of makes a head with two arms coming out. And I took to my Blake book, and he has a poem in there called "Night in the Songs of Innocence," where he talked about the moon. So I put the two things together.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this tree sap thing you're doing. I have the utmost respect for maple syrup, because every time I put a spoon of it in my coffee, I realize it's like a quart of tree sap made that spoon
Right?
of maple syrup. So it's super concentrated, mineral rich, blood of the earth
You know
way
what?
to sweeten your coffee.
Have you ever had it straight out of the tree?
Never. I'd love to.
Oh gosh. I mean, it's essentially slightly sugary water,
Uh-huh.
because maple syrup is basically 40 parts sap, ends up with 1 part syrup.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. So therefore 1 teaspoon is about a quart of
Yeah,
sap. That's incredible offering, right? That's such concentrated
it is. It's a
energy.
distillation, and it's poetry, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
also because the connection to the tree and the page and the pencil, uh, everything is everything.
Awesome. So, now knowing what you know about astrology, based coming from your intellectual framework, what would you suggest to my students in terms of um, easing their process of getting meaning,
Hmm.
which I think is a painful thing, because students want to get it right if they're devoted students,
Oh yeah.
but astrology calls for something else.
Yeah. Probably the worst thing you can do is be concerned about getting things right. Be more concerned with getting things relevant, because
Mhm.
relevance is right.
Mm-hmm.
It comes back to that comment. Well, if that's what you took from the poem, then that's what I meant. You know.
Though with poems, there is a level where you really can connect with with the poet's intention, I think, and you're getting the effect of the poem.
Sure. And that drives home the point that there are many different ways to approach something. Um, if you want to be effective, um, widen your pool. You know, it comes back to that as well. Don't there's a great um, uh, danger, I guess, in having too narrow a focus, and this comes back to the linear versus non-linear
Hmm.
thing as well.
Hmm.
Um, Try coming at it from different angles, different perspectives.
Hmm.
For example, my grandfather Marshall, although he was a religious man, he was a Catholic. He started out his day reading his Bible,
In five
but
languages, is that a true fact?
in several languages, not just five. So what he did was when he traveled, he would check the nightstand beside the bed, and there was a copy of the Gideon's Bible
Of course.
in whatever language of the country he happened to be in. This was important, and why the Bible is so great is because they're fanatical about translation, right? And being consistent along translations. So the Gideon's Bible in English, you can trust that the French translation and the English translation are going to agree. So Marshall picked up these Bibles whenever he came across them, and he started off his day reading his Bible um, in several different languages. He'd read a bit from the English, from the French, from the German, from the Italian. And the reason is because our languages are our eyes on the world. And every language is a different way of seeing through those eyes, right? Um, there's that phrase lost in translation, how, things you don't quite get the same sense of something when you translate it from Italian into English, because the Italian is a different way of perceiving and experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
So by adding languages, you're adding ways of seeing and ways of experiencing, ways of knowing, ways of interpreting.
Mm-hmm.
Think about how you might apply that uh, to your approach to astrology. I think that would be my biggest piece of advice:
Well, let's
enlarging your
see.
vocabulary, your language.
Well, I think that's I think that's the ongoing slow study of smaller planets
Hmm.
and the history of how the well established ones got to be the things they are. And then my thing with language, my favorite thing about language is the concept of an idiom
Ah,
in terms of translating from one to the other. And so idioms are fabulous. The way the weird, unique thing is said in a language, that specific quirky metaphor that you can't really translate it. Sometimes if you've got a clever person who's got a poetic sense, they can make it beautiful for you, and you
yeah.
you get a feeling for it. But in many ways, astrology is a huge study in idioms because there is no all of the parts of the language of astrology that would be wrote, this means this and this means that, are completely stricken. Now, people do rely on the books heavily sometimes, and they can get caught in translating the left to right type of knowledge into the chart, which we all need someone doing of that. I think you might consider that. But once you're into astrology, the whole thing's idiomatic.
Hmm.
The chart never repeats itself. You might see an aspect that you've seen at some point in the past, but it's going to be built differently. It's going to be in different signs and different houses, and so Venus square Mars can have 1,000 different modes of expression, even though the books will still say Venus square Mars means that. The reality is that Venus square Mars, as it manifests, is always idiomatic.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of it comes down to what's your question?
Yes, yes, that's what begins horary astrology. Is you begin with a question, and you cast when you understand the question.
Hmm.
And this completely turns the concept of natal astrology on its ear. because or the tradition is I cast when I understand the question. So I'm waiting for the moment where I'm corresponding with the client and like I know what they're on about. I'm like, I get your point. That's when I cast. Others, it's when the doorman thumps on the door with the letter and you open the letter, dear astrologer, I need to know the following. So it's a random moment that's used for horary, and it only is as good as the way that you phrase the question, because the way you phrase the question leads to every other expression of the chart, including, for example, what house. Like, let's say you have a question, you have to decide which of these 12 houses the question pertains to.
Mm.
If you get the letter and it's about your sibling's wife's estate, right? Your brother's wife's inheritance from her uncle. Well, that's a series of things that you can use the rules of astrology to say, well, sibling is third, and then wife is the seventh from the third, and then uncle, I forget which is you go so many houses for uncle, and then you land up siblings, wife's uncle, boom, and you start there. So the question with astrology is what's your question? And then with horary, which I think is the master art form of it all, is where do you land your question? And
Mm.
if your question becomes a ninth house question, that's ninth, that's 11th, the ninth house question, then that from that will cascade one whole set of assumptions. We're going to look to Mercury because it's Virgo. We're going to look to Mercury as the ruler of the question. You always check what rules the first house. You always check the moon, and then you go through a series of kind of diagnostics. And then but it's more like panning for gold. It's much less like, you look up the price of something and it's like, this thing is sold for $4.99, that's how much you're going to get billed for. It's not that level of like, well, that is that. And so you're sort of like shaking the chart and seeing where things land and where they fit the rules, and then where that chart, how that describes a situation. There's a little mimesis to it. And it's one of the tests of radicality. Does this chart describe the question being asked?
Mm-hmm.
And you can get yes, no, or maybe, and sometimes it seems to, and you go with it, and then as you get deeper and you realize this is incredible. Like once you've actually done it, like I've never actually walked you through a chart where your jaw's hanging at the end of the chart, where you can't even believe it. The moment of astrology brings you through some of those charts where it's like, how is this even possible? And that's a whole other kind of like discovery than the thing is $4.99 and your bill should say $4.99. That works well in commerce. But it's different with astrology, and training that combination of like looseness and rigor is the challenge, I think, of training an astrologer.
Mm-hmm.
How to be grounded in your syntax and then also leave your imagination on.
Well, this also comes back to the musician,
Mm-hmm.
where you're studying, you're practicing, you're studying your chords and your
Modes and
modes exactly. But then you throw that all out the window when you perform with others, and you let go and trust that the foundation is there and set.
yes,
and you improvise.
yes, yep. And then there might also be that one moment where like you realize that the Mixolydian mode is going to be the thing that works, and presto, it does. Like it's almost like a random application of your training. You're not going into it like a lesson. It's another thing that happens where that tool comes to life in that moment.
Mm-hmm. I love the word question, because
It's a quest.
the answer is in the word, the quest.
Yep.
And Marshall, he said, I don't explain, I explore. And that
Yes.
might be a mantra for your students.
Yes, we explore the chart. Yes.
But exploration doesn't have to be random. You know, I mean, it can be, but uh, exploration, the explorer is equipped with tools, with knowledge,
Hmm.
with skills,
Hmm.
to save yourself time and and to shore yourself up against calamity, right? You want to know something of the nature of the ocean. You want to be able to read your stars. Um,
Some of
and
the astronauts got home because they recognized the constellations. I think
really,
it might have been John Glenn got back because he freaking knew the constellations,
very good.
and he was able to like line the ship up. And the channel, and then Apollo 13 also had a similar thing going on. But John Glenn knew the constellations he was looking at, knew where they belonged.
So the trick about exploration is to be skilled. Uh, it's good to have a destination in mind, but don't get so um, married to your destination that you will pass by significance and let it go by because it's not what you're looking for. Because a quest is a process of discovery.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Well, one of my maxims of astrology is that it's better for asking questions than it is for getting answers.
there you are.
Astrology frames you if you skilled enough to use, and this is where my investigative reporting on one hand and the astrology on the other come into play, because the astrology really is very good at guiding questions.
Well, and questions are infinitely more valuable than answers.
Definitely,
A
because
good
every
question.
question, yep. Yeah, question is worth 1,000 answers. Good question, right? I mean,
Yep.
and that's, and you know, at Delphi, that was the thing. You had to ask the question the right way. You know, you had to be careful what you asked, because someone wrote, I forget, it was one of these books back here. Someone says, well, you know, if divination has a mind, it's a lot like a lawyer's mind, because in law, how you ask the question very much determines the answer and the
Mm.
context of the answer. And the same answer can get you off the hook in one situation and get you in big trouble in another situation, for example, in law. And so you want to phrase your question carefully,
Mm.
with any form, tarot or any I Ching, astrology, divination. You know,
Mm-hmm. Well, be careful what you ask for and what you wish for.
well, that's important also. You know, do you want to know the answer to that? And one nice thing about the horary chart is that it comes with a set of things that say when you can toss the chart. They're
Mm.
called strictures against judgment. And I think you know, that this is why horary is fabulous in its first task of evaluating the chart for its general relevance and the question, should I read this chart? That's included in horary. Natal astrology, you don't get that luxury because the kid was born and there's not much you can do.
Sure.
But with
This,
horary,
this, of course, is the difference between the law, because lawyers are trained to never ask a question to which they do not know the answer,
yes,
because they recognize the pitfalls.
and it's a game of kill. It's a confrontational situation
Yeah.
in law, where it's ritualized single combat. Basically, you're trying to off
Skill,
your opponent, and so
mm,
it's more of a chess strategy of luring people into traps and setting them up with antecedent questions, and
skill or be killed.
they fall. Yeah, and they fall for your language, and then but astrology suspends that, really. I mean, and that I think is the beauty of it, and it really is the closest to musicalizing the intellect,
Mm.
essentially, because it really requires a lot of intellectual rigor. Every one of these signs has a history and a culture, and a from 5 different cultures. It's got constellations, and the planets have discoverers and their context, and everything. And the more of that you know, the more you have to reach in and get. And yet sometimes very simple approaches work also.
Mm.
You know, for all the times I've used 50 planets in a chart, sometimes the best information just comes from like one of the old ones straight away. And one of the rules I use is that the chart with 50 planets needs to be basically saying the same thing as the chart with 6 planets or 7 planets, to look for the ways the theme repeats. Again, a musical concept, right? Of
Mm.
how a 3-piece orchestra would play it versus how a 10 or 20 or 30 piece would play it. It's got to be the same piece of music to work out.
Yeah. Yeah, the melody is the base.
Yes, the melody is the base. Though one interesting thing about astrology is it's a collection of rhythms,
Hmm.
because you've got the daily rhythm spinning the whole thing around once, the lunar rhythm going once a month, the solar rhythm going once a year, the solar lunar rhythm going with the eclipses, right? So the sun, the moon, and the nodes, they go off every 6 months,
Hmm.
and then they all start to fit together. So it would seem that in astrology, the melody is built on top of the rhythm.
Same in music. It's all about the backbeat.
Very often, yes. That's why it's get a good bass player, and you're in good shape.
Yeah.
Um, what else here? Any other thoughts you've had like about astrology over the years, and maybe your observations on how you see me practicing astrology that might help my students to put into words that I might not do?
Oh goodness. I mean, it's I have a very I don't even know enough about astrology to be dangerous.
But you've
That's
read
how
my
little.
work though, and you see how I use it.
Sure. And this is why I've paid any attention at all, because I've seen how useful it can be. You've taken it uh, a long way, and by no means exhausted the avenues, which is fascinating.
No, it's endless.
Um, and I think you're an example to everything that I've been saying, which is that uh, you get out what you put in, and the more that you bring to the table, the more that you're able to. Um, I'm losing myself in my metaphors, but the more things you bring to a conversation, the wider, the more rich the conversation is going to be. And I think what you're quite adept in is adding the layers of meaning and richness. Uh, and I'm sure your students know this, or they wouldn't be your students.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we'll vibe that to them. And uh, you know, my intent for my students is to have a more inquisitive and relaxed experience of reading a chart, and less the like headachy experience of expecting absolutes to come out of it.
Oh, good. Your approach and my approach are very similar, because when I taught this course on understanding media, I made clear that this isn't a lecture; it's a workshop. You know, I'm not at the front of the room telling you all what to take away. I'm leading an exploration. I'm a navigator,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a process of mutual exploration
Mm-hmm.
and discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And when that's the case, the class, the voyage, are as good as the students. So your students should know that they're all there not just to learn, but to participate in this process of mutual discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And that's valuable for the individual and for the group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and beginning astrology students come up with stuff just as brilliant as advanced astrology students. It's a matter of just catching the glint of the light a certain way, and then
Yep.
just coming out and saying it.
And the message of that is to try and maintain your inner student, you know, because when you lose that is when you get too comfortable and you think you know too much. And the one thing an astrologer should know is how little they know, right?
Well, our one of the shining examples in our field in the early modern era, from I think 17. Now I'm drawing a blank on the year this published. Is the book Christian Astrology by William Lilly, and he is just the most delightful writer, and one of the most lucid, easygoing, but technically brilliant astrologers, and he always referred to himself as the student in astrology. That's how he would sign off, as the student in astrology. And it's
Very
William
smart.
fucking Lilly. It's like the monster of all horary readers, who could find the dead fish, could find the stolen fish, who could find the lost cat, with a horary chart. The student in astrology.
Listen, don't trust somebody who tells you they've got the answers. But when somebody tells you they have the questions, follow
It's time
them.
to start listening.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, listen, thank you. Thank you. This has added a beautiful little kind of angle of outside the realm of astrology, and like bringing like fitting astrology into the much larger intellectual tradition of which it's a part. Astrology, it's not a thing that stands apart. It is right in the DNA of classical knowledge.
Oh, sure. Yep. The trivium and the quadrivium.
Yes, I was going to mention that. So
Do we
there's
have
a lot of
another hour?
divisions of 3 and 4. Well, in another hour we can do that. But just to pre-cap that,
Yep.
there's a lot of uses of 3s and 4s in astrology. So there's the triplicities, which are cardinal, fixed, and mutable signs.
Okay.
Are they the first sign of the season, the middle sign of the season, or the ending sign of the season? I.e., the season always begins with a cardinal sign, Aries, spring, and then it develops with a fixed sign, Taurus, mid-spring, and then the season blends out to the next one with a mutable sign, Gemini. Those are the that's the trip that's the those are the quadruplicities, because okay, and the triplicities are the elements, right? Cardinal no. Oh, okay, I'm not looking at this. There's two, basically. One studies the elements and one studies the type of sign that's not related to the elements. You can have a fixed water sign, you can have a mutable fire sign, Sagittarius. And so in the division of 3 and 4, the quad and the tri, you then can start to cook up all these interesting ways to develop that theme.
Uh-huh.
Every layer of astrology, you could take out 90% of it and leave yourself with a blank wheel, and the thing would still work. Another ridiculous property of astrology is just by studying a blank wheel, you can figure things out.
Nice.
It is one weird language. It's quite an invention. I mean, so here we are. Thank you very much. Andrew McLuhan will put all kinds of contact information for you up. This understanding media class, you can still get it, right? You can.
I'm working on
the recordings. Can you?
I'm working on having the recordings available. You expressed interest in that, and I'm starting the second part. It's ended up being 3 parts. The second part's going to start in about 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So I better get that up and running.
Okay.
The McLuhaninstitute.com is where you'll find everything.
Fabulous.
Thank you, Eric.
All right, Andrew, thank you as ever once again. And love to all those other McLuhans floating around on the astral plane.
Thank you.
On whose shoulders we stand. It blows my mind sometimes. I mean, as you know, I think that Marshall McLuhan was one of the towering creative geniuses of the 20th century, right there with Buckminster Fuller and Tesla.
Uh-huh.
And it is, to even have any proximity to that tradition at all is just an incredible honor. And it's been amazing fun over the years figuring out the internet, which is where we started. What's this internet thingy?
Well,
what is this internet thing? We better figure this out.
I feel quite honored to be in the position I'm in. It's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, heir to an intellectual fortune and some very loving people.
Thank you, sir.
Funny. Marshall McLuhan is fucking funny. when you're paying attention, and your dad would slip in the little jabs in between the lines, like, oh, that was really funny. He said that 3 days ago, and now I get the joke.
Oh yeah, well, exactly. And you could always tell by the twinkle. Yes. You'd be like, oh shit, he just pulled something over on me. What was it? Yep. And the other person, that's the fun thing about being a McLuhan, I guess. It doesn't matter if the other person gets the joke. In fact, it's better if they don't.
Yep. But your kid cares if you think that they're funny. All right, Andrew, love, happy full moon.
Thank you.
And Kate in the background recording all this. Thank you very much. Katerina, show your, let's see, pop back in. Let's say hello and thank you.
Okay, just a second.
Okay.
She's still there.
Yes,
Thank you, Katerina.
Yes. Yeah, we've been training the Planet Waves team on Zoom. So if you need a Zoom team, Kate's been one of the people who's been like, Zoom is definitely a right or wrong thing, but there's a lot of options.
Nice. Good to talk to you guys. Take care.
Lots of love. Screenshot. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.